basically, I want to, again, thank you for inviting me, Adrian. And he also spoke to my students a couple years ago. It was wonderful to have him speaking to us. I was very honored. And now I'm so happy to be able to return the favor a little bit to this illustrious group together today. So my thoughts are the following. One, I think we need to think about what, at least in America, speaking for myself in this country, we can do after Trump. Like right now, we're in the midst of the bad period with this ridiculous person who's in charge doing all kinds of stuff that doesn't make any sense, that's illogical, that's cruel, that's stupid. But I think we have to think about what do we do after that period is over. And looking at the election results in Hungary yesterday, I have great, great hope that if people in America come out and vote, they too can absolutely, definitely get rid of this scourge that we're currently under. But it's going to take a real concerted civic engagement, and I hope the Americans have it in themselves to do that. I'm holding out hope that that happens. Um, I'm going to say a few remarks about sort of the macro picture of higher education, not so much related to refugee assistance, but more the bigger picture that I've gathered from reading literature and talking to experts recently. Then I'll say a few words about my research lab called the Refugee Educational Advancement Laboratory, or REAL, which I think is a pretty good acronym to remember. And then maybe end with some hopeful thoughts and notes, and then turn it over to my colleague Jessica Crist, who was a fantastic student and went on to be a co-editor of a book we published, also the author of an article we published. She's gone on to publish on her own and to be represented in different forums. So she's a really excellent academic with a very bright future. So it's such an honor to be with her today as well. Um, so just a couple of remarks. One of my thoughts is from a paper that I wrote in 2019 for the Journal of Comparative and International Higher Education. And at that time, I really wanted to make the case that student mobility is much too narrowly looked at. Like we only really look at kids who study abroad. And those are really privileged people in most cases who have the ability and the money to go basically wherever they want, often just because it's fun. So I called that mobility for enlightenment. And it's a pretty small number. It's about 7 million people globally who voluntarily engage in, study abroad because they're able to. The second group is what I call mobility for opportunity. Those are a much bigger number of people, around 3.7% of the global population, that are migrants, people moving for economic opportunity. They're leaving because they have to find better jobs to support their families and basically have better livelihoods somewhere else. They don't really want to leave their home, but they do because it's more opportunity for them and their family. So they're mobility for opportunity. And then the third group I called mobility for survival. And those are people who have to leave because if they don't leave, they're going to die or be killed. And those are most cases refugees. And that's about 117 million people at this point who have had to flee their homes, either in country, so internally displaced, or elsewhere in another country, usually a neighboring country, but also further away from home because they have no choice. If they don't leave, they're going to die. And those are the mobility for survival group, the third group of people who engage in academic mobility, as I call it. So we have to have a much broader lens for looking at that. So that was one paper, and I'm happy to share it if you're interested. I can send it to Adrian, and you can look at it if you're interested. It's very short, and it's very simple, sort of a think piece, an opinion piece. The other paper I'll refer to is a 2023 and 2024 paper, which we published in a journal with Rajika Bandari and Lisa Brunner. And that really talked about how international mobile students are often positioned as relatively homogenous with common motivations and experiences. And that is a fallacy. That is not true. They're a very not homogenous group. Again, people who engage in mobility, like I just said, do it for really different reasons. They're not just this monolith. So we have to be much more subtle in how we understand the reasons for people's mobility and their choices for that, whatever it might be, whether for enlightenment, opportunity, or survival. So at this point, there's a real lack of statistics on student transition to permanent residency. For example, refugees who engage in education are customarily not counted as international students, and therefore they're labeled and theorized differently than they really ought to be. they're not looked at in terms of a very specific group that has very different needs than other groupings might have. Again, those who are doing it for fun. So I'll also share some remarks now from some of my colleagues in international education that study issues that concern all of us. This is from the International Higher Education Journal, which is published by Boston College's Center for International Higher Education. And the people that I'll be citing are Philip Altbach and Hans de Witt, Chris Glass, Laura Rumbley, and Simon Marginson. So I want to give credit to those scholars. This is not my own work, it's their work. So Philip Altbach and Hans de Witt argue that in many ways, higher education, this is no surprise, is used as a pawn. And we see this in our government. This government in my country is really going hardcore against universities, and they're using them as sort of political chess pieces to try to further their agenda in ways that are antithetical to academic freedom and open inquiry. They want to narrowly prescribe that to a very, very prescribed and very decidedly, I think, undemocratic way. And they say that it's, that they're trying to be open to all viewpoints, but I really don't see that actually playing out at all. I see the opposite. So Philip Altbach and Hans de Witt argue that security concerns are eclipsing the value of international collaboration. In the global north, enrollment is really declining, and accompanying financial crisis follows. With enrollment declines, we have a financial problem, certainly at a private university like mine at George Washington University. So that's a major issue for the northern countries. In the meantime, in the global south, global education is for the first time, they're not for the first time, but there's more and more students seeking access to higher education. So there's a massification in the global south, and there's a shrinking in the global north, and this has financial implications that I think we really need to think about. So for the first time, they argue global higher education is becoming less international than it's been. It's becoming more regional and local and less sort of globally focused. The way, think about, Senator Fulbright thought about, the Fulbright program, or the Peace Corps thought about extending this idea of learning and education and opportunity and assistance globally. Yes, it was from an American perspective, there's no doubt. It was a North American initiative, but I think the ideals were really for peace and security and a better life for people globally. And that's really changing now. There's much more locking in and shutting down and narrowing of focus to fit very specific political agendas that serve a small minority and don't help a lot of other people. So the core values that have always been advocated by the West, and particularly the United States, things like academic freedom, academic integrity, responsibility of society, and higher education's role in that, are really no longer guaranteed. They're really coming under assault. I think, okay, to cite another scholar, Laura Rumbley, sorry about the noise. Laura Rumbley argues that we're really suffering from two problems: the lack of high quality, large scale, longitudinal data that really helps us understand what's happening in global mobility. We don't have good data. We have a lot of qualitative studies and a few big studies, but we don't really have an overarching sense of what's really happening based on empirical data. That's one problem. And another problem, I think a bigger one even, is that internationalization in higher ed is invisible or underappreciated or underutilized by those who don't engage in it. And that's really the vast majority of people. Again, looking at education for enlightenment, at least, that I talked about earlier, that's a very small percentage of privileged and lucky people. Most people, half the people in this country don't have passports. They're not going anywhere outside our borders. So they're not engaging in learning abroad, and they don't care about it. So that's another problem. And then I'll finish up with Simon Marginson, who's a really well-known scholar. He's at Oxford University. He says that, quote, I'm going to quote here, while participation in research continue to grow, in most of the Euro-American West, the favorable conditions for cross-border activity have vanished. The consensus on global integration has gone. Western working-class communities that gained nothing from globalization oppose all cross-border openness. Again, they're left out. They don't see the value of it because they don't participate in it. They don't see why they should, and they're not able to. So, and then at the same time, we have coercive interventions, the type I talked about in this country, by national governments, are really posing a broad challenge for higher education and scholarship. So the perspective of these experts in the field are largely very, very negative, as you can see, based on the current situation. But I do want to again say that I think what happened yesterday in Hungary holds out a great deal of hope. People have to become engaged. That's the only way things are going to change. The courts aren't doing enough, institutions aren't doing enough, and our Congress is basically a rubber stamp at this point, at least on the Republican side. So we're in a lot of trouble, but that can change, I think. Um, just quickly, my lab that I started called the Refugee Educational Advancement Laboratory, REAL, was really just to get students to go beyond the classroom, to do things more actively, to be more engaged, to use their agency to make a difference, not just to write a paper and to learn something from doing that, but to then take that knowledge and that enthusiasm and find a way to do, advocacy, social engagement, broader sort of thinking about the issues in academic fora, but also beyond those. And that's something that the lab continues to do. We're 5 years in now and growing and really pretty active. So I'm very proud of what the Real Lab established. I just started actually another lab last year with colleagues from Ukraine called the Ukraine Research Group in Education and National Transition. And this, or urgent, because I like to have a good acronym. So urgent is that acronym, because I think people remember good acronyms. And that's another effort to get students that are in a master's program, we only have them for about a year and a half, to get them deeply engaged in issues where they can really make a difference in the time that we have with them and do something in collaboration with people outside the university and outside the United States. So I'm really proud of that lab as well. And ending with a hopeful note, I'll just refer back to what we were talking about with Adrian the other day, where he said that, look, success stories of resilience, they can be told. They're evidence of success, and people remember stories much more than they remember statistics. People don't remember facts and figures, but they do remember a story about somebody who did something that's memorable. So I think that's very powerful empirical data, even if we may only take quantitative data seriously, which is a mistake. There's great qualitative and ethnographic data to be had and to do something with that can be really, really inspiring. So I think it's important to listen to those stories. So a whole of society humanistic, selfless approach can really make a difference and be a powerful counterweight to this horrible term, compassion fatigue, which is so sad. It's, I mean, how can we become fatigued with the apparent needs and obvious wants and rightful, lives people should be able to lead? I mean, we can't become apathetic. We can't lose that compassion and become fatigued. We have to keep trying. And that's obviously what your group down in Mexico is doing. And it's been a pleasure to speak with you and to share my opinion. So thank you so much. And I'll turn it over now to my dear colleague, Jessica Crist. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I echo Bernhard's comments about just being very grateful for this opportunity. I was a co-founder in the Refugee Education Advancement Lab back a few years ago. I won't say exactly how many, because it will make me sad. But we have done a lot of work together, and we've focused on educational opportunities for refugee and at-risk migrant populations. I currently work at American University, specifically in the College of Law, working with foreign attorneys who are coming to the United States or who are already here in the United States, getting their credential to then become attorneys here in the US. So I have the privilege of working with a lot of migrant populations, specifically Afghan, Irani students who are already here in the US and looking to be able to get their credential and move forward with their career here. So again, a pleasure to be here. I think Bernhard had a lot of really great remarks about things that we have been seeing in the field, and I'd love to provide a little bit of context from the Latin American perspective. So with Latin America, and Bernhard mentioned, okay, we need to look towards the end of Trump. And I think, unfortunately, in Latin America, even when Trump is gone, even when his 4 years are up and he moves on, the lasting effects in Latin America are going to continue because of this turn to the right that we've seen, in on the political spectrum. So thinking about Chile, Ecuador, Peru, all of these countries that are now electing these new leaders who are honestly following in Trump's footsteps in a lot of these cases. So we're seeing a lot of nationalistic sentiments. We're seeing anti-migration policies, and a lot of this is fueled by this fear of crime. And one of the quotes that Bernhard said was security concerns eclipsing education. And I think that reigns true not only for the US, but also in the Latin American context as well. And I think we can look at that with the Venezuelan migrant case. So that's something that I've focused on, and Bernhard and I actually co-authored an article about Venezuelan migrants in education in Latin America. And I think one of the issues that we see with the Venezuelan migrants is that they're not classified as refugees officially. So they're considered economic migrants. They're not necessarily considered this mobility for survival. They're considered the mobility for opportunity, which is not necessarily true in this case. So that really does impact them negatively when it comes to accessing services, accessing education, and just general integration into society. And then adding into this anti-migrant, anti-Venezuelan sentiment that's being proposed and just purported everywhere by government, but then also by media within the region, it really does impact their future within their resettlement countries. So what kind of things are impacting access to education in Latin America? One of the big ones is credential issues. So credentials not being recognized, not available or accessible from their home country, and a lack of regularization on policy to allow for these credentials to be recognized. So you have folks who are coming to their resettlement country and they are educated. They do have these credentials behind them, but it's not being recognized in the country that they're resettling in. So they're basically starting from zero, which then leads to economic issues. So they're not able to then enter into the workforce in the way that they had in their home country, or they're being told that they need to start over in education, which is more costly than what they were expecting. So that plays a factor then in their ability to access the education opportunity. And then just in general, there's a lack of information. There's no centralization of resources for these people. There's no way to see how they can be able to access these systems and access education. And that's really impacting their ability to get in and to understand what the next steps are. So in general, refugee access to higher education is up to 7%, which is a huge increase from what we've seen in the past 5, 6, 7 years of just 1% of refugees being able to access higher education. So there are things that are happening that are good, but we have to look forward and protect that as we are facing extreme administrative and systemic issues that are going to drop this number and are geared towards dropping this number. So turning again to the US and thinking about Latin American students who are coming to the US, which is something that the US has seen for many, many years. So we can think about those who are already here. And then we can also think about those who are mobility for enlightenment, mobility for opportunity, and mobility for survival, that are either coming here because they want to study here and increase their knowledge. They want the opportunity to have more economic mobility or add a credential to their list, or the survival. We have folks in Latin America who are facing life or death situations and are migrating to the US for safety and security. So we have all three coming to the US from Latin America, and they all face barriers to accessing higher education here. So first, coming from an admissions background myself, admissions barriers. You have to pay to apply to schools. You have to take required tests, English tests and SATs and ACTs and all of these standardized tests that US universities require. And all of those come with fees as well. A lot of schools require transcript evaluations, credentialing evaluations. So you have to send your transcripts off somewhere else and pay money for somebody to tell you what type of degree you have. All of these things are just an extra step in the process that somebody who is already here in the US and is a US citizen would not have to consider when they apply for higher education. There are also then the legal barriers. So as we're seeing, there have been quite a few banned countries who are no longer issuing student visas or any visas to students who want to come and study in the US. So this is locking out full countries full of folks who maybe want to come and study here. So we're looking at 39 different countries that currently cannot issue any student or non-immigrant visas, and some of them even immigrant visas they're not issuing. So that's an issue in itself. Visa denials are significantly up. So even if you are doing everything correctly, the visa officer in the embassy in your home country can just stamp no, and that's that for you. So even after investing the time to apply, investing all of the time and money to get to that point, you can still be denied. And then for those who are already here, this new sentiment of anti-migrant, the unwelcoming feeling that exists in our country at the moment, ICE agents walking around college campuses, makes it difficult for somebody who, even if they're not in an irregular status, even if they are a permanent resident or a naturalized citizen, does not feel safe or welcome to then come onto campus and continue to study. So this is another barrier that we're seeing. And then, as Bernhard mentioned before, funding. Cuts to federal funding, cuts to university funding, all of this trickles down to affect student level. So if university cuts research, if federal government cuts research grants to university has to find that money somewhere else. Then that takes money from the scholarship fund, which we were giving to international students, and now we don't have any way to scholarship these students. So this is what we're seeing and what's going to be a long-term effect of everything that has happened. It's going to take universities years to recuperate from this financial loss. And unfortunately, the people who will be affected are students. And I think that's what has not been examined or lost or proven from the federal government and from university administrations as well. So all of this to say, very pessimistic, but all of this to say that everything that has happened in the last 1 year, 12 months, 14 months is going to continue to have effects and ripples throughout the next decade within the international education space, and especially for refugee and at-risk migrants who are already not receiving the services and that they need and are not given the attention and ideas that need to be given to them to succeed. So, I hope that, as Bernhard said, things are getting a little bit more regional. So while global education, is kind of being separated, I'm hoping that could mean that other regions of the world are going to be more open to refugees and at-risk migrants, and we can see this shifting happening. But as far as the Americas, I think that we will see over the next few years just a decrease and just a harder time for our at-risk migrant populations to be able to access these services in education and outside of education as well. So I guess I will leave it at that. And we got to keep fighting the good fight and hoping that we can make some type of moves and at least encourage funding to be funneled into the right places so that we can continue the work that we do. But we have a long road ahead, and we just have to stick together and keep fighting for those students who deserve that. So thank you.